Hello, my name is Philippe Girard, a professor in the history department at McNeese State University.
And I'm Sarah Bollock, a liberal studies major at McNeese. Welcome to Your Grandma Rocks, where we explore the lives of famous women in history.
Welcome and bienvenue à nos amis francophones. Vous écoutez la radio de l'Université McNeese.
On the program today, music and history as we retrace the life of a remarkable woman. She was a poet named Violet de Cristoforo.
I love Italian poets. We actually did a show on another one. She was named Isabella di Mora, I remember.
Actually, she was Japanese descent. Her birth name was Kazu Yamane.
Okay, well, we also did a Japanese lady once. The name was the Geisha Okichi.
Well, actually, she was a U.S. citizen.
Okay, now I'm confused. So who was she exactly?
Well, that's the question. She spent most of her life caught between two cultures. She was a Japanese American who went to internment camps during World War II and struggled to figure out whether she was American or Japanese, and whether either one of those two countries even wanted her in the first place.
Okay, poetry, war, and national identity. That should be an interesting mix.
Along the way, we'll sample some music related to her multiple identities, starting with the Pearly Shells, a classic from Hawaii where she was born.
Pearly shell, yasashiku, tsunami, hikaru, koboreru, nami no shizuku ni sabishiku tara hitotsu. Pupu, ikanuku, hey love mai, kame aho, ahi aina, mahina kubunna mai, alla hele bulo, ella hele nakaupa. Nanega alla emolele gamali hey kuahi aulanda oeva evaleana kamakani ogaida hey agamole hey alave ke alo pearly shell irakeba munewa itamu shienjuno ikarini usuru anohi no ireyo anohi no ireyo.
Bonjour and welcome back to Your Grammar Rocks. Je m'appelle Philippe Girard.
And I'm Sarah Bollock. Today, we're exploring the life of Violet de Cristoforo, a Japanese-American poet who spent World War II in internment camps.
And a little note to our listeners. I try to involve my history students in the show, and today's a case in point. My co-host today, she came up with the topic on her own, and she did all the research as part of her senior thesis. So today I'm going to take a back seat, let Sarah take the lead, and just ask a few questions along the way. Let's start with a simple question. When and where was Our Lady born, Violet de Cristoforo?
She was born in Hawaii in 1917. Her parents were Japanese immigrants, so she was actually born under the name Kazu Yamane.
Okay, but she was born on U.S. soil, right?
Correct.
Okay, I'm asking because people often make a distinction between the Issei, I-S-S-E-I, who are Japanese immigrants born in Japan like her parents were, and then the Nisei and I-S-E-I, who are second-generation immigrants born in the U.S. So she was a Nisei, a natural-born citizen of the U.S. So you mentioned earlier that the main question about her was, what was her national identity? Where did she belong? And the answer should be easy. She was born in the U.S., so she was an American. End of story. Let's wrap up the show.
Well, not so fast. She still kept close ties in her home country. As a child, she went to Japan to study at a school in Hiroshima where her mom was from. But she also had close ties to the U.S. too. Her parents were close to the Stewarts, an Anglo-American family in Hawaii, When the Stewards left for California, Our Lady Kazuya Main was interested in their care. So in the 1930s, she lived a very Anglo life in California with her adoptive parents. They raised her as a Catholic. They changed her name to Violet, and she eventually graduated from high school in Fresno in 1934.
Okay, so to me, the character arc is clear. She started out with strong ties to her Japanese birth family, and then she moved to California and became an all-American girl with her Anglo adoptive parents. That seemed to me like the typical journey of an immigrant, becoming American.
It was actually more complicated than that because she backtracked quite a bit. After she graduated from high school, she married another Japanese American named Shiro Masuda.
Okay, so we need to change her name again. She's no longer Kazue Yamane or Violet Stewart, but now she's Violet Matsuda.
Yes, her many name changes are a way to track down her shifting alliances. Her marriage to Masuda renewed her ties with Japan. Her in-laws were recent immigrants. They were devout Buddhists who only spoke Japanese. In 1940, Violet took another trip to Japan with her in-laws to attend Japanese etiquette school and reconnect with her birth family in Hiroshima.
Wow, she was really caught between two worlds, which might create a problem. You just mentioned the year 1940. I don't know much about your topic, but I do know one thing. On December 7th of 1941, the Japanese Imperial Navy attacked the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor. So how did the war impact Violet Matsuda? Which side did she pick in World War II?
Let's save that for later. We need to take another musical break.
Actually, I know which song we should play now. When I talked about taping this show, my daughter, Flora, she told me there is a Japanese-American singer named Mitski, who is pretty popular right now.
That seems appropriate for her show.
It is. So here's Strawberry Blonde by the Japanese-American singer Mitski.
I love everybody because I love you. When you stood up, walked away barefoot, and the grass where you lay left a bed in your shape. I looked over it and I ached. I love everybody because I love you. I don't need the city and I don't need proof. All I need, darling, is a life in your shape. I picture it soft and I ache. Look at you, strawberry blonde. Trying to hold the wind. You tell me you love her, I give you a grin. Oh, all I ever wanted was a life in your shape. So I follow the white lines, keep my eyes on the road as I ache. Look at you, strawberry blonde, fields rolling on. I love it when you call my name. Can you hear the bumblebees swarm, watching your arm? I love it when you look my way. Look at you, strawberry blonde, fields rolling on.
Welcome back. I'm Sarah Bollock, co-host to Your Grandma Rocks.
Et je suis Philippe Girard. Vous écoutez la radio de l'Université McNeese.
Today we're exploring the life of Violet de Cristoforo, a Japanese-American poet who spent her life caught between two cultures.
Before our break, we had gotten to the year 1941 when the attack on Pearl Harbor forced her to pick between her two countries, the U.S. and Japan. So which side was she on in World War II?
The U.S. When the war broke out, she volunteered to help the U.S. Red Cross, but things didn't turn out exactly how she wanted.
You're referring to those Japanese-American internment camps in World War II?
Yeah. In 1942, President FDR signed Executive Order 9066, which ordered the mass internment of all people of Japanese descent in the U.S.
So just to be clear, these people had not committed a crime. They were just suspected of potential treason due to their origins.
And because of their skin color, I'd say Italian Americans and German Americans were not sent to the camps during World War II, even though the U.S. was also at war with Mussolini and Hitler.
So also to clarify, that order by FDR that applied to the legal aliens born in Japan, the Issei, but also the native-born American citizens, the Nisei.
Yes, people like Violet Masuda, who were Americans by birth but still sent to jail. She was sent to an internment camp in Fresno in 1942.
So what was her experience like in the camps?
Absolutely horrible. She was still recovering from surgery from her abdomen and 3 months pregnant with her third child, which was not ideal given the harsh conditions in the camp. Later on, Violet and her family were sent to another camp in Arkansas where conditions were no better.
How did she internalize all of that? It can't have been easy to see her country, by which I mean the U.S., turn on her like that. So was her allegiance to the U.S. shaken in some way?
It was. In 1943, she had to fill out a loyalty questionnaire for the U.S., where she was asked to forswear any allegiance to the Japanese emperor, cut off any ties with Japan. But then the U.S. would not treat her as a real citizen either. So she ran the risk of being left stateless. She was faced with an impossible choice.
So in the end, which country did she pick on the loyalty questionnaire?
Neither. She simply didn't answer the question, and neither did her family. As punishment, they were transferred to yet another camp back in Tule, California.
Well, I assume that camp was not pleasant either if it was intended as punishment, right?
She got to reunite with her birth family, but conditions were tough, yes. Her brother was accused of stealing food, so he was thrown into a stockade known as the bullpen. He spent 10 months there in isolation. Then her mother-in-law was diagnosed with cancer. Violet begged authorities to help her brother and her mother-in-law, but as a result, she was labeled a troublemaker.
Wow. The ordeal that Violet Matsuda and her relatives went through in the camps, that must have really shaken her face in the U.S.
It did. She wrote Japanese poetry to cope with her sense of being cast out by her own country. In one haiku, she wrote, "How abandoned I felt, how I longed to have the authorities heed my pleas for justice and humane treatment."
So did she ask to return to Japan then, since the U.S. did not want to treat her right?
She kind of went back and forth on the subject. Her husband returned to Japan, where he was born, but Violet, who was born in U.S. soil, was more hesitant.
So which year are we talking about?
1945.
Well, by that time, Japan had clearly lost the war and had pretty much been bombed back to the Stone Age by the U.S. Air Force. So I understand why she would be hesitant to move to Japan at that point, no matter how badly the U.S. would have treated her during the war.
It didn't seem to matter because she had refused to fill out the loyalty questionnaire. She was no longer seen as a U.S. citizen. In 1946, she had to leave for Japan.
Well, arriving in a country that was not really hers, with a bunch of young kids, right in the aftermath of a world war, that can't have been easy. But let's save that story for our next segment, Lil. What is our next song on the list?
Here's a period-appropriate song, We'll Walk Alone by Martha Tilton. It's from 1944.
I'll walk alone because to tell you the truth, I'll be lonely. I don't mind being lonely when my heart tells me you are lonely too. I'll walk alone. They'll ask me why, and I'll tell them I'd rather. There are dreams I must gather, dreams we fashioned the night you held me tight. I'll always be near you wherever you are each night. In every prayer, if you call, I'll hear you. No matter how far, just close your eyes and I'll be there. Please walk alone and send your love and your kisses to guide me till you're walking beside me. I'll walk alone. love and your kisses to guide me till you're walking beside me. I'll walk alone. I'll walk alone.
Bonjour à tous and welcome back to Your Grandma Rocks. Je suis Philippe Girard.
And I'm Sarah Bollock. Today we're covering the life of Japanese-American poet Violet de Cristoforo.
Before our break, we went over her experiences in Japanese-American internment camps during World War II, which were pretty awful. She had always seen herself as an American, and yet she was treated as an enemy alien. We got all the way to 1946 when the U.S. government deported her to Japan against her will. So what was it like to arrive to a country that she barely knew right after the end of a world war?
It was bad. She and her kids were sent to a holding camp that was used for demobilized soldiers. For 1 week, she didn't even change her clothes given the lack of privacy. Food was also tight.
Well, Japan was close to starvation right after World War II. I remember reading somewhere that this is when the Japanese began to hunt and eat whales because there was no other food to eat. But Violet, didn't she have at least some relatives in Japan, like her birth family and her husband as well?
Well, yes and no. Her husband went to Japan just a few months before Violet did, but by the time she got there, he had already remarried a Japanese woman.
Well, that was quick. He had clearly made up his mind. He was going to burn all his bridges with his life in America, including his American wife, Violet. So what about the birth family of Violet? You told us earlier that they lived in Hiroshima. Oh, wait, that can't be a good saying. That's where the first atomic bomb was dropped.
She did go to Hiroshima, but obviously conditions were as awful as you would expect. All that was left of the train station in Hiroshima was a concrete platform. Violet Masuda spent her first night huddled with her children under a newspaper for warmth and just cried. She eventually reunited with her birth mom, who had been severely burnt by the atomic bomb, but her mom had not seen her for so long that she could barely recognize her own daughter.
So basically, she had no real ties to Japan anymore.
None. Here's what she wrote. The war devastated Japan, and we were not accepted in Japan either. First of all, because we were different.
I understand that. And she had spent most of her life in the U.S., so Japanese people, they would have seen her as a foreigner. And feelings toward the U.S., they were probably not very positive right after World War II. So we're back to her as a person who is lost between two cultures, Japan and the U.S.
With nowhere else to turn, Violet turned to American forces. She worked for the U.S. occupational troops as a translator.
And did she try to return physically to the U.S., the country, at that point?
She tried, but then they stripped her of her U.S. citizenship by then, so she couldn't. She sought help with her adoptive parents, the Stewarts, who managed to get her children to the U.S. She also turned to the Catholic Church for help.
You mentioned before that she had been raised as a Catholic, and you also mentioned that her in-laws were devout Buddhists. So in the end, she picked Catholicism, right?
Yes, she had finally got baptized in Japan.
Well, that's kind of symbolic. Buddhism and Shintoism, these are the two traditional religions in Japan. And I teach that in the history class, so I can tell you, when Jesuit monks introduced Catholicism in the 1500s, the rulers at the time, the Tokugawa shoguns, they persecuted Catholics because they thought that religion was foreign and disloyal. So I would say that when Violet Matsuda picked Catholicism after World War II, that was a clear sign that her loyalties lay in the West. Actually, I just called her Violet Matsuda, but her first husband had dumped her by then, so maybe we need to change her name once again. So tell me, what was her name by then?
In 1953, while she was still in Japan, she met U.S. Army officer Wilfred H. de Cristoforo, and she married him.
So that's where we get the Italian-American name that she ended up with, Violet de Cristoforo. I get it now. Not to get too crass, but that marriage to a U.S. citizen, that was her ticket out of Japan.
It was. She and her new husband returned to the U.S. in 1956.
Wow, she kept bouncing back and forth between one country and the next. But we'll study that next phase in her life after our next song. We need to take a break.
I figured since she was in love with an Italian-American guy, we need to play some Frank Sinatra.
I think it's required by law. But he did a lot of great songs. So which song by Frank Sinatra did you pick?
She returned in the U.S. in 1956, the year Sinatra released his album Songs for Swingin' Love. So let's listen to a song that was played on the radio the year that she returned to the U.S. Here's Pennies from Heaven by Frank Sinatra.
Every time it rains, pennies from heaven. Don't you know each cloud contains pennies from heaven? You'll find your fortunes falling all over the town. Be sure that your umbrella is upside down. Trade them for a package of sunshine and flowers. If you want the things you love, you must have showers. So when you hear it thunder, don't run under a tree. There'll be pennies from heaven for you and me. Of sunshine and flowers. If you want the things you love, you must have showers. So when you hear it thunder, don't run under a tree. There'll be pennies from heaven for you and
listening to Your Grandma Rocks on KBYS. I'm Sarah Bollock.
Et je suis Philippe Girard. Today we are retracing the life of Violet de Cristoforo, a Japanese-American poet.
So far, we retraced her childhood, which was split between Hawaii, Japan, and California.
Then her difficult experiences in World War II when her birth country, the U.S., turned on her and she spent years in internment camps.
And also her difficulties experienced in World War II when she went to Japan, the country of her ancestors, and the country also turned on her.
By 1956, though, she was back in the U.S. So her return settled the question for good, right? Violet de Cristoforo was an American after all.
Well, no, her return did not solve her identity crisis. Her two oldest children...
The one that she had repatriated to the U.S. after World War II?
Yes. They would not speak to her because they felt she had abandoned them. They cut off all their ties to her and to Japan. They wouldn't marry Japanese. For the longest time in life, I tried to lose my identity as Japanese, she later said.
Well, she must have held a grudge from the time that she had returned to Japan after World War II and her first husband had ditched her. But what about the U.S.? Didn't she have a grudge against that country too, at least against the U.S. government? I mean, after all, she and her family had spent years in internment camps during World War II, even though they had committed no crime.
There was some lingering resentment, yes, but it eased over time. In 1981, she testified before the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians.
Meaning the commission that investigated the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, right?
Yes, this forced her to finally revisit the events of World War II and find some closure.
Well, as I recall, the U.S. government passed a law in the 1980s to pay an indemnity to the people who had been wrongfully imprisoned in World War II.
Yes, she got $20,000 for that.
And then, as I recall, George H.W. Bush Sr., he formally apologized on behalf of the U.S. When he was president. So it took time, but her country, by which I mean the U.S., finally recognized that it had done wrong to her.
Yes, that helped her reconcile herself with her American side. But in her later years, the Cristoforo finally embraced her Japanese-American dual culture as well. She self-published a book on her haikus that she had written when she was interned in Tule Lake during World War II.
So to get back to our central question of identity, which language did she pick for her poems? English or Japanese?
Both. It was a two-language edition.
So she had finally found a way to resolve her identity crisis. I don't want to choose between the two countries.
Yes, a reporter who came to her home observed how it was decorated with Oriental furniture and curio cabinets filled with little wooden Chinese dolls, but she served homemade pizza with tomatoes and basil from her garden.
Asian knickknacks and Italian-American pizza. I love it. I guess that answers all of our questions regarding her identity. In the end, it was all of the above, the American melting pot. Well, it's a happy ending after a tough life. Do we have time for one last song?
We'll end with a song known in the U.S. as Sukiyaki. It's a Japanese song, but it was a huge hit in the U.S. in the 1960s. So it's a great way to end the story on a woman who was caught between two worlds.
Bienvenue à tous. This was a song Sukiyaki by the Japanese crooner Kyu Sakamoto. Je m'appelle Philippe Girard.
And I'm Sarah Bollock. You're listening to Your Grandma Rocks on KBYS, a show about famous women from centuries past. Today, we retrace the life of Violet de Cristoforo, a Japanese-American poet who spent World War II in U.S. internment camps.
And also spent her life trying to figure out whether she was Japanese or American.
And eventually realized that she was both.
And a bit Italian, too.
Well, what a life. We're glad we could share it with you.
Quelle vie incroyable, en effet.
This program was funded by Juliet Hartner, Grant for Women in the Humanities.
And research by one of our very own graduates, Sarah Bolich, my co-host.